So hi, everybody. This is week 9. We are almost done. We are actually doing the last week with topics that might show up on the test today. So week 10 is something different. We'll do a review. We'll talk about other things. We'll get you ready for the test. If you want to take the test in Rochester, I'll point you in the right direction to the right door, actually. We can do practice tests, or we can do whatever you want me to do. So here is your chance to say, hey, can you go over this topic again? Because I really cannot wrap my head around it. Can you just discuss this question, because I still don't know what the right answer is. So for the next week, think about what you want to talk about, or what you want me to talk about, and then just send me an email or bring this up at the beginning of next week, and then we can make a list of things to cover. Let me do one thing here. Share my screen, and you should be able to see my screen now. Yes. But I wanted to show you this. So this is one of the things, one of the links that I provided you when we talked about propagation. This is the radio communications dashboard that our government puts out. And this is not just for us hams. This is important for people who use GPS systems, people who use other radio services, or if you are operating a satellite. All this information is important, and we get to benefit from that. Another benefit of this is you can actually figure out when we might have an aurora. So when it's worth driving up to the lake on a clear night and looking north to see whether we can spot any aurora borealis. So here is the aurora forecast. This all looks very bad as far as aurora possibilities go. When you see green, there's nothing happening. Once this turns yellow, orange, or even red, then it's time to go up to the lake. So there are some numbers here that make sense to somebody who knows a little bit more about how this all works. This is a little bit too early for you to dive into this. There are some numbers up here, and all this stuff tells us how radio propagation is and whether there's anything going on that can get in the way of good propagation. So whenever you see all green, this is good. This is what we want to see. But this is something to play around once you have your license and once you actually get into operating on the HF bands. So for today, I have again, whoops, what just happened? I do not know what key I just hit, but I definitely turned off screen sharing, and I did not know that you can do that with just one key press. Actually, I turned off a monitor. What the heck happened? Okay, let's try this again. Sorry about that. Come on. We're almost there. Okay. The usual reminder about license testing, we're still hovering at 10 out of 25, so still quite a bit left. So today we have 2 modules. First one is about safety. this is probably the most important chapter in the book, because this will keep you safe and the people around you. In the second module today, we'll talk about radio frequency interference. But let's talk about safety first. The most obvious thing that we have to deal with is electricity, because everything that we do is powered by electricity. And we know when we touch live wires, bad stuff can happen. So when we have a problem with an electrical injury, we're talking about shocks and burns. Shock means the muscles will contract because of the electricity. Our muscles are controlled by electricity in our bodies. There's electricity coming from the nerves or running through the nerves, and they control the muscles. And if we overload that with current from the outside, we end up with a shock.
Hey, Carl.
The thing is, we can deal. We might be dealing with burns. So when you touch something and there's a high current flowing through your body, your tissue will actually burn.
Hey, Carl.
The good news is that today our radios use much lower voltages than back when our radios were tube-based. Yes?
Carol, you're all messed up on the screen. You're cutting in and out.
Mode.
Go ahead. Can you hear me?
No.
No. Hello. Can you hear me?
No.
That. Let me turn my camera off. Maybe that will save a little bit of bandwidth. Is this any better? Switch to my plan B. Let me just. I don't know whether it has to do with recording it or with sharing the screen. I don't know what the deal is. So let's go back to this slide, and hopefully we'll have an hour or so that we can just get through this. So the equipment that we use today uses much lower voltages, which keeps us a lot safer. Tubes use several hundred volts. If you had an amplifier, maybe several thousand volts within your radio. And there is I have a table here that lists what different currents, what the effect of different currents would be on your body. And this goes from you can't really feel it when it's below 1 milliamp to you will die. None of these things are on the test, so we can skip over that. There is something really weird going on with my system. And it only does that when I am on Zoom with you guys. I don't use Zoom on a regular basis anymore, but it only happens with this meeting, and I have no clue why that is. I rebooted my computer this morning or actually this afternoon, just to make sure that everything was in proper order, and it is just not cooperating. Now my presentation is gone again. Okay. So how do we keep safe with the dangers of electricity? Now, the most obvious thing is, of course, avoiding contact with anything that carries a current. And one thing to make sure that we're not touching anything that is potentially powered on is we unplug the equipment before we work on it. If you are around electricians and electrical engineers a lot, you might get the impression that they're pretty lazy people because they always have one hand in their pocket. But this is actually to keep them safe, because if you only touch a hot wire with one hand, then you will have a current that will flow through your body. But the problem is, if you touch it with both hands, if you have one hand on ground, the other hand on the hot wire, that current will flow across your body or across your heart and will very likely stop your heart. So by having only one hand potentially in contact with an electric voltage, and the other hand in a safe spot in your pocket, you can very likely avoid that. That current will then go through your legs, but may not go through your heart the same way it would if you create a nice circuit for that current with your two hands. Make sure your equipment is grounded, and then use power from a GFCI protected circuit. A GFCI is a ground fault circuit interrupter. And that little gadget will notice if there's a current that is not going through the wires, but going somewhere else, and it will shut that circuit off and hopefully protect you. Sometimes we do have to work on live equipment because we have to make some measurements, and you can only do this if your radio is running. In that case, remove jewelry. Anything metal that you have on you might just get in touch with something that's not supposed to touch. Avoid unintentional touching of circuitry. Yeah, that's easier said than done. It's not intentional. So we have to really work around all those parts of the circuit that are carrying a current. Some devices have safety interlocks, and that means if you open the cover, if you get access to the guts of the system, it turns the power off. If you have such a thing, never ever bypass that safety interlock. That is there for a reason. And that potentially means that we cannot service that piece of equipment, but it's very likely very dangerous to do that. That's why they put that interlock there. So don't even think about that. Now, you might have your device powered off and unplugged, but if there are big capacitors in it, they may still carry quite a charge. So we need to discharge them before we put our hands in there. And we already know that when we deal with storage batteries or starter batteries, lead acid batteries, these can be very dangerous when you short them out.
How do you discharge capacitors?
With a resistor, you would build a little gadget that has that clips on to ground on one side, and then has a stick with a resistor wired to it that you can touch to the capacitor, and that will discharge it. If you come across somebody who's hanging off a live wire, the first thing you do is you remove the power. You do not try to pull that guy off that live wire, because what would happen then is that both of you would be attached to that live wire, and you both might die. So remove power before you do anything else. And because of that, if we are dealing with high voltages, make sure that there's a clearly marked on-off switch that other people can see and can interact with if they come across you in distress. You might think about installing an emergency master power switch for your ham shack and let everybody in your house know where that is and how to use it. Once you have removed the power, call for help, and it's never a bad idea to learn about CPR and first aid so that you can help in a situation like that, but only after you remove the power. Grounding. Grounding is something that we do for several different reasons in ham radio. And this is the first out of 3 slides that we have about grounding. We do grounding, electrical grounding, because the electrical code requires it. So when you look at the outlets in your house, hopefully they have 3 contacts. One of them will be ground. And when you use a 3-wire power cord, that ground will get carried to whatever you plug into that outlet. So never ever try to put one of these little adapters that people use for Christmas lights on a 3-wire cord so that you can plug it into a 2-wire cord, because that would remove the ground protection that you have on your equipment. And we use that so that the metal case, for example, of a radio or an amplifier is connected to ground. So when a wire inside gets loose and happens to touch that case from the inside, it creates a short to ground. And then hopefully the circuit breaker or the ground fault interrupter will engage, and you will not have a high voltage on that case when you touch it. If you remove the ground, then you don't have this protection. And when you just happen to have your hand on that case, on a metal knob or a metal switch, or on your metal microphone, for example, you will be the recipient of that electrical shock. Use proper fuses and circuit breaker sizes. Never ever replace a fuse with a smaller rated fuse, a lower rated fuse. So if you have, actually with a higher rated fuse, so if the fuse is a 10 amp fuse, never ever try to put a 20 amp fuse in there, because you might actually cause a fire by doing that. And we've all seen these power strips that have other power strips plugged into them, like a porcupine. Don't do that. Don't try to overload a single outlet or a circuit by plugging too many things into it. If you need to do that, see if you can rewire your shack and potentially put a different outlet on a different circuit into your shack. So this was number 1. We do it for safety. Grounding also has an effect on RF. Our antennas need a ground, our radios need a ground to work against. And in this case, if we don't have a proper ground, we can end up with RF burns, radio frequency burns, from high radio frequency voltage. Now, unlike the electrical injuries we talked about before, these RF burns are usually harmless but painful. You might smell some burnt skin and you feel a bite from that RF, but it will not kill you, at least not at the power levels that we use in ham radio. If you're working in a 50 kilowatt AM broadcast transmitter, that's a different thing. But with the power levels that we deal with, they are painful, but they are not dangerous. We can prevent these hotspots, these RF hotspots, by connecting all our equipment together with heavy wire or a metal strap. And we call that then bonding. Don't use a braided strap for that, like the braided strap that you would use to connect your car battery to the body of the car. These braided straps are not recommended at RF. We want a solid strap. We can prevent other people from suffering from RF burns by keeping them away from our antennas and radials and counterpoise wires. These are all parts of antennas that could potentially have carry this RF voltage. So keep those people away from your antenna structures and anything connected to the antenna that will keep them safe. In addition to all that, we also want to ground our equipment for AC safety, which was the previous slide. So we now have grounding for safety. We have grounding to prevent RF hotspots. And now the third reason for grounding is lightning protection. We need to ground antennas and towers to local code. And that means for an antenna tower, use an 8-foot ground rod for each tower leg. This is the answer to one of the questions. You need to bond the rods together to the tower legs and to all the other rods that you have connect around your tower leg. So we need to connect the tower, we need to connect the ground rod to the tower, and we need to connect the ground rod to the other ground rods around that tower leg. The ground connection should be as short as possible. Again, answer to a question. You need to avoid sharp bends. Answer to a question. Why? Because when the lightning sees that sharp bend, it may not be able to take that curve and shoot right out of that wire. So when you have a 90-degree bend in your wire and you are suffering from a lightning strike, there's a good chance that that lightning will exit that wire at that point. By having a nice round bend, you can keep the high current from the lightning strike in that ground connection. Use lightning arresters on a single ground plate where cables enter the house. You would have a round rod that's coming out from the ground. You mount a metal plate to that ground rod, and every lightning arrestor that you have for every run of coax that you have would go through that metal plate. And then unplug and disconnect equipment, including telephones, landlines, computers, and feed lines if lightning is expected. Now, if you have a direct lightning strike, none of this will matter. You cannot avoid damage from that. But if you have a lightning strike nearby, doing this will help you to protect your equipment. RF exposure. When you turn on your microwave and you put a bowl of water in it, the energy that is heating the water is actually RF energy, radio frequency energy. There is an antenna in there in the microwave that directs those radio frequency waves at your food, and they heat it. We are dealing with radio frequency energy, so can we cook a chicken with our radios? Yes, you might. And because of that, we need to also be cautious when it comes to RF exposure. Now, electromagnetic radiation, or EMR, is not the same as radioactivity. We are dealing with much lower energy, and lower energy means that radio waves cannot cause genetic mutations as can be caused by radioactivity. But what RF energy does, it heats body tissue, and this is exactly what we're taking advantage of in the microwave oven. The heating depends on the RF intensity and the frequency. So when you look at the frequency range that microwave ovens use, it's up in the low gigahertz area, because that is very efficient to heat water molecules. If we take the necessary precautions, then RF exposure is minimal and not dangerous to us. Now, if you have a highly directional antenna, like a dish antenna, and you transmit through that, you want to make sure that nobody is directly in front of that dish, because that is where you have a high concentration of RF energy, and this is where you could cook your chicken. And our brains, if we just happen to be in front of that thing. But for less directional antennas, we don't have to take quite as much precaution. When it comes to figuring out how far away from an antenna you need to be, we need to talk about RF intensity. And we measure that power density in the unit watts per square centimeter. So if you have a 100-watt transmitter, puts out 100 watts, and you happen to have a really small antenna that is highly directional, and you have 1 square centimeter in front of that antenna, and all the energy is going that way, then we would have a power density of 100 watts per square centimeter. The power levels that we deal with are lower, much lower. You'll see that in a minute. But what it comes down to is the higher power density means higher RF exposure. The RF absorption varies with frequency because of body part sizes. And why is that? When we talked about antennas and resonant frequencies, we said a dipole antenna, which is a quarter wavelength long, is very efficient to collect radio frequency. So if we have a body part that's half a wavelength long, like my arm, that might collect certain frequencies very efficiently. And this is actually what happens. So because of that, we have safe exposure levels that vary by frequency. And these safe exposure levels have been established by the FCC. Now, in the past, we could take a shortcut to figure out what the RF intensity in our around our antennas would be. There was a simple table-based approach, but a couple of years ago, the FCC said, nah, you can't do that anymore. You have to do a little bit more work. And this is why we need to know about this stuff. So here is the curves that we need to be aware of for maximum permissible exposure, or MPE, for different frequencies. So when we look at the axis down here, it goes from 0.3 megahertz, which is 300 kilohertz, to 100,000 megahertz, which is 100 gigahertz. Our HF band is here, and then we have the VHF band here. So HF, VHF, and then UHF here. And you see we start up with a permissible exposure level of 100 milliwatts per square centimeter until we get to 3 megahertz, and then it goes down until we leave the HF frequency range. So over the HF range, it goes down, and then it stays constant on the VHF range, which is also where it is the lowest, and then it goes up again. So that it is the lowest here in the VHF range is actually the clue to one of the questions. We have two curves here. One is called the controlled, the other one the uncontrolled. And we see that the uncontrolled is lower. It allows a lower maximum permissible exposure than the controlled. So if we are in a controlled environment, we can run more power. When we are in an uncontrolled environment, we need to run a lower power. What is the difference? Controlled environment means you know where the people are standing in relationship to your antenna, and you can do something about that. You can yell at Bob and say, hey, Bob, move away. And Bob will, of course, do that. So you have control over where people are. And because of that, a higher power density is allowed because you can make adjustments if needed. You can yell at Bob. The uncontrolled environment means you have no control over people near your antenna. And this could be your antenna is a wire in your backyard, and then every week you have somebody come in and mow the lawn. Your ham shack is on the other side of the building, so you don't know when there's somebody underneath your antenna. So you cannot yell at Bob and say, hey, Bob, move your mower away from the antenna. So in the uncontrolled environment, we need to make sure that the power levels always are at a safe level. Lower power density is required because you cannot control or adjust the exposure of people. So this is the difference between controlled and uncontrolled. In order to figure out how much exposure somebody actually has to power, we have to consider yet another thing, and that is the duty cycle and duty factor. Duty cycle is the percentage of time that a transmitter is on during the evaluation period. What does that mean? You've probably noticed when you cook something in the microwave, the table turns all the time if you have a rotating table, rotating plate, but the microwave actually cycles through full power periods, and then it goes down to no power for a certain time. Then it goes up to full power again, and then it goes down to no power. Because most microwaves, there is one brand that is an exception, they cannot control how much power they are putting out into the inside of your microwave. They can only do full power or no power. And they just average that. So you say, I'm cooking something for a minute, and then for 10 seconds, the microwave is on, for 10 seconds, it's off, for 10 seconds, it's on, or 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off, 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off. It averages out to 50%. If you select a 10% power level, it will keep those off times longer, and it will only be on for 10% of the time. This is duty cycle. The same thing applies to our radios. If we are transmitting only half of the time, we have a duty cycle of 50%. And that means we can actually run more power because that duty cycle gets factored in. Duty factor is the same as duty cycle, but here we don't talk about a percentage between 0 and 100. We talk about a number between 0 and 1.0. So 50% duty cycle would be a duty factor of 0.5. Higher duty cycle or duty factor means higher average power density and exposure. So if we have 100%, then the power is on all the time, and we are exposed to power all the time. Whereas if we run the same amount of power, but only for half the time, we can actually crank up the power to get the same exposure level. So this allows us some flexibility. When we look at different modes that we use, we come up with a mode duty cycle. So this is for how long the transmitter is on, and the mode duty cycle is how our operating modes actually affect how much power is put out. So there are some here that list 100%. SSB AFSK, auto frequency shift keying, and SSB SSTV, slow scan amateur TV. Voice AM, no modulation. Voice FM, we already learned that with FM, there is always the same power, regardless of how of what signal we're trying to encode or modulate. It's always, the transmitter is always providing full power when it's on. And down here, if we just have a simple carrier without any modulation, it's also 100%. A lot of the other modes have a lower duty cycle, and the most obvious one is Morse code. With Morse code, you are going from no power to full power to no power to full power in your dits and dahs. So when we look at Morse code here, where is CW? Conversational CW down here, they say 40%. So you run 100-watt power with CW, with all the dits and dahs and the gaps in between, you are actually only transmitting for 40% of the time. Conversational SSB 20%, because we usually never modulate that transmitter to 100%. This only happens for split seconds, for very short moments at voice peaks. The rest of the time, it's a lot less than that. So this is another thing that we factor in when we determine the power level that we can run. So why is this important? Because all stations, it used to be all fixed stations and it excluded mobile stations or portable stations, but now it's all stations must perform an exposure evaluation. You need to do that for your station at home or in your car. And there are 3 ways to do that. You can use an online calculator. This is the easiest, and I highly recommend that. You can model the exposure with software. It gets a lot more difficult, and you probably don't want to do that unless you really like to do antenna modeling, because this is a side effect of doing a model of your antenna in software. And then there are gadgets that we can buy, and we can measure the RF power density. And here it says most difficult. The difficult part is coming up with the money for this, because these are pretty expensive. You need a calibrated device, and you don't find them for just a few bucks on eBay. This is professional equipment that they will have at commercial broadcast stations, but we hams usually don't have access to that. So for us, the online calculator is the way to do it. The ARL, in cooperation with the FCC, provides a lot of information about how to perform such an RF exposure evaluation, and they provide one of these calculators that we can use. The link is here. What you need for this is the power at the antenna. And that means it's the transmit power minus the feed line loss. When we talked about feed lines, we said every feed line is lossy. Some of them are less lossy than others, or some of them are more lossy than others. So that feed line loss all of a sudden is important here. And we can calculate that usually by knowing what type of coax cable we have, how long that run of coax is, and then there are tables where you can say, for 100 feet of this type of coax, I will have a loss of 2.5 dB. Those annoying dBs again, they will not leave you alone anymore, because all of this is done with dBs. Then we need the antenna gain. the operating frequency, and antenna gain means when you use an online calculator, they will give you a few types of antennas to pick from. And if you have a different antenna, then you need to look that up in the manufacturer information or from other sources. Yeah, we need the operating frequency, the duty cycle, the transmit versus receive duty cycle. So how long am I transmitting? How long am I listening? And depending on what type of operating you do, you could be transmitting for a short point of time and then listen for a long duration. If you're participating in nets, for example, where the microphone comes to you only every 10 minutes and the rest of the time you listen. So all that information you collect and then you plug it into this online calculator. And they do provide, as they say here, detailed instructions for each parameter. So they tell you exactly what you need to look for in order to, what data to look for in order to do this online calculation. And here you see our mode duty cycle goes into this, the power at the antenna, the transmit duty cycle, how long am I listening, how long am I transmitting, the antenna gain, the operating frequency. And then you hit a button and it tells you at this frequency, you have to stay with this power, with this frequency, with this antenna, you have to stay 3 feet and 7 inches away from the antenna. And you do this for all the frequencies, all the bands that you are planning on transmitting on with your station. And then every time you change something in your station, you have to re-evaluate it. So you put a new antenna up, you buy a new transmitter, you get better coax cable, you go back and re-evaluate your station. So what if the data that comes out of it says, yeah, I can't really operate because I am sitting too close to my antenna? What can you do to reduce your RF exposure? You can relocate or reorient the antennas. If you have antennas that are hanging in trees, try to get them 10 feet higher. That will make a big difference. If you have directional antennas, don't point them at where you are, point them away from you. So raise the antenna, we've already mentioned that. Reduce the antenna gain, meaning use a crappier antenna. If that's the only way to resolve your problems, then yep, this is the way you need to go, but this is usually not something that we want to do. We want to use the best possible antenna that we can afford or that fits in our backyard. We can reduce the RF power output. That is an easy way to resolve the issue. I think I've told you I like to operate QRP, meaning low power, which means usually 5 watts or less. You may remember on HF frequencies, your power limit will be 200 watts, and on VHF and UHF frequencies, it will be 1,500 watts. 5 watts is oftentimes enough power to make the contact. Not all the time, but oftentimes it is. So you don't need to run a boatload of power. And that makes it really easy to keep the RF exposure down. And you can also change to a lower duty cycle mode. So we saw FM was 100%, CW was 40%, SSB, conversational SSB was 20%. So when you switch to SSB from FM, you can actually run 5 times as much power with the same RF exposure that you would have with FM. But also, if you keep the power the same, your exposure goes down to 1/5. A little bit more about safety, mobile safety. When we have radios in our cars, we want to make sure that when we hit the brakes, nothing will come flying through the car and hits us in the back of our heads. So secure all equipment so that it cannot get airborne. Place all the equipment so that you can actually operate it safely when driving. Know local rules for use of communications equipment while driving. So we all know with cell phones, you need some gadget that allows you to use the phone without having to hold it up to your ear. With amateur radio gear, at least in New York State, they say, yeah, you have an FCC license. You know what you're doing. So we allow you to actually hold on to that microphone while you're driving. Other states have different rules. So make sure you know what the local rules are when you drive around. In some states, you may need a hands-free microphone. Power line safety. The problem with our antennas is we try to put them as high up as possible. And this is also where the power lines usually are. So when we put antennas up, we have to make sure to keep them well away from power lines. Before you put up any antenna, make sure you know where the power lines are. And then we need to provide a minimum of 10 feet of clearance if the antenna falls. So it's not just sufficient to have 10 feet of clearance from the antenna to the power line. If that antenna wire snaps and bounces around in the wind, gets whipped around, it might still be able to connect to that power line. So make sure that regardless of what happens, you have at least 10 feet clearance when the antenna falls. And then never attach antennas or guy lines to utility poles or structures. Again, there is the risk of actually the power line falling and hitting your antenna. How do most hams die if it's not of old age? By falling from antenna towers. Every year you read stories like this. Maine radio amateur dies after fall from tower. We unfortunately see these news items too often. In QST, the ARL magazine, this was an article from, or actually an editorial from the August issue of last year, where they talk about somebody who actually was an expert in climbing towers and still fell from the tower and died. It happens. And this is a good reason not to have a tower in your backyard. You are much safer without an antenna tower. But if you decide that you need an antenna tower, there are some basic tips. The most important one is always work with somebody who knows what they're doing. Never try to figure it out on your own. Learn from somebody with experience. Make sure that you have the proper clothing, hard hat, and eye protection. Use a proper climbing harness for tower climbing, not a lineman's belt or rock climbing gear. Use something that was specifically made for this purpose. Next one is the answer to one of the questions. Don't climb a crank-up tower supported only by its lift cable. You need to block and secure it first. What is a crank-up tower? A crank-up tower is something that looks relatively small when the top element is not cranked up. And there's a crank there, unless it's electrical, and you crank that thing, and a cable will pull that top piece up until it is in position. The problem is if that top piece is up and you start to climb that thing and that cable says, yeah, those additional 200 pounds I do not like, and snaps, you come flying down, and we do not want that. So make sure that either you block that top piece so that it cannot go anywhere, even if the cable snaps, or just do all the maintenance work with everything on ground level. Use a chin pole to lift heavy items. There used to be a question on the test. I don't think it's there anymore. Here is a link to a Wikipedia page that describes what a chin pole is and how you would use it. If you're not planning on constructing a tower, you do not need to know this. And most importantly, do not work alone. Have somebody there, have a ground crew. And even if they don't do much, they are the ones who will be able to call 911 if something happens to you. And this is the end of the first module. I don't want to go through all the questions. As Brad said, this is pretty straightforward. You should be able to do this on your own. Let's see if we can find some interesting questions. So this one, at which of the following frequencies does maximum permissible exposure have the lowest value? You may remember the curve. It looked like something like this. And the lowest value was where? Do you remember this? It was in the VHF region. So when you look at these numbers here, which frequency is in the VHF frequency region? I saw some fingers, but I couldn't count them. The right answer is B, 50 megahertz. So VHF, just to remind you, is 30 to 300 megahertz. And 50 is here. So 3.5 is here. 440 is somewhere here, and 1.2 gigahertz somewhere up here. So they all have higher values. It's the VHF region that has the lowest value, and it is 50 megahertz or the 6-meter band. This is a tricky one. How does the allowable power density for RF safety change if duty cycle changes from 100% to 50%? So we switch from a duty cycle mode of 100% FM, for example, to a duty cycle mode of 50%. That was roughly CW. How does the allowable power density change?
Is that D?
It's actually C. It increases by a factor of 2.
That's right.
Because we only transmit 50% of the time with CW, for example, we can actually run twice as much power because it all comes down to averages, just like your microwave. So by changing my duty cycle mode, and if I want to stay at the same power density level, I can crank up my power by a factor of 2. Why is duty cycle one of the factors used to determine safe RF radiation exposure levels? Because it's all about average. So we average out the power over time. What is the purpose of a safety wire through a turnbuckle used to tension guy lines? Okay, I don't see anybody on the screen anymore. I only have one camera that's on, and John just left. So, yes, what's the right answer?
A.
A, yes, it's to secure the guy if the turn. No, actually, no, it's not. It's not A. It's to prevent loosening of the guy line from vibration.
Okay.
Do you know what a turnbuckle is?
Yes.
Yeah. So it has these two screws, and when the wind is whipping that guy line around, those screws could actually get loosened by that vibration, and then eventually that thing will just come apart. And by putting a safety wire through the turnbuckle, you will prevent that from happening, so that that middle piece does not turn. Just to make sure that you don't forget this, under what circumstances is it safe to climb a tower without a helper or observer? Never, never ever do that. Always have somebody there with a phone so that they can 911 if you fall. So this is the end of module 9A. Let me switch to 9B. We have about 45 minutes. This is not 9B. Oh, this is 9B. So in our second module, we'll talk about RFI. We've heard this before, radio frequency interference. This can be a signal that comes from the outside and is interfering with you, but it can also be a signal that's coming from your own station, even from within your own radio, and is interfering with yourself. If we are dealing with this, we might have to do some detective work to figure out where that signal is actually coming from and whether there is something that we can do about this. There are different types of RFI that we deal with. Direct detection means the offending signal gets into the electronic circuits to cause interference. So I have WHAM, the broadcast tower, about 2 miles from my house. They're running 50 kilowatts. If that transmitter is not broken, which it is actually currently, so they're only running 10 kilowatts. But when that gets fixed again, I'm dealing with 50 kilowatts in my backyard again. And that signal comes in through everything that has a wire attached to it. And it's overloading my radios if I'm not careful. Oops. And put filters in front of the radios. So this is a very strong signal that overwhelms the ability of the receiver to reject it. Then we can have RF current, and this can be picked up by cables of consumer equipment. So this means you have a TV or just an audio amplifier that has speakers connected to it. It has maybe a turntable connected to it. It has wires connected to it. And then you transmit on your radio. And every time you transmit, those speakers start to buzz. And this is RF current that gets picked up by, for example, the cables that connect the speakers, gets into that amplifier and causes problems in there, gets amplified, comes out of the speakers again. And we can filter this out with the right tools. And then we can have transmitted harmonics. Harmonics we talked about in week 2. I said if we have a fundamental frequency of 7 megahertz, we have a harmonic at 14 megahertz, we have another one at 21 megahertz, and so on. And if you have a bad transmitter, there's a possibility that it will not filter out those harmonics and they just go through the antenna and then get transmitted. And they must be filtered out at the transmitter. So there's an FCC requirement that tells you how much you need to attenuate those signals, those harmonics, so that only your primary, your fundamental frequency gets transmitted. How do we deal with most of these problems? With filters. A filter in general is something that attenuates or reduces a signal. And they come in different flavors. We have a high pass filter that lets, so our frequencies are here, that lets higher frequencies pass through without change, but lower frequencies here in this range, they get reduced. We can have the opposite, a low pass filter. Again, this is frequency. So a low pass filter would let lower frequencies through without any change. And then the higher frequencies up here, they get reduced. When we combine the two, we can have a band pass filter. A band pass filter lets certain frequencies through. So we have one frequency here, frequency 1, frequency 2, and anything between those two frequencies goes through without change. Everything else gets blocked. This is the ideal. When you have an actual filter in front of you, it doesn't quite work that way. These slopes are not as steep as we want them to be. So there's always something that gets through that we don't want. But by designing the filter in a proper way, you can get as much of those signals that you want through without attenuation, and the other signals filtered out. A notch filter is the opposite of a band pass filter. So with a notch filter, we have just a small, let me just clear this out, a small range of frequencies that get filtered out. And in my case, this could be the frequency of WHAM. And I would have that in front of my radio, and it would filter that frequency out, and it would let everything else more or less go through without change. So by selecting the correct filter, we can then filter out certain signals. But in order to pick which filter we want, we need to understand the source of the interference. And that also means we need to figure out where we would put that filter in order to prevent this interference. Ferrite chokes are a really easy way to filter out a bunch of stuff. They are made of some magnetic material that you put around a wire, or you wind a wire through a toroid, a ring that is made out of this ferrite material. So you put that wire around it. And they create an impedance. And just a reminder, this is an opposition to AC current on cables and wires. Now, when you look at the cables that are connected to your computers, some of these cables have a much thicker piece close to the connectors. So you have the cable, the thin cable in between the two ends, and then all of a sudden it gets thick and then thin again. And where it gets thick, there's a good chance that you have a ferrite in there to block this RF frequency that can potentially run through these cables. So they can be used to block RF currents that cause interference to entertainment equipment, microphones, monitors, amplifiers. So if your voice comes out of your neighbor's stereo equipment whenever you transmit, you put ferrites on every cable that goes in and out of that amplifier at your neighbor's house, and there's a good chance that that will take care of it. So you wind the cable through that ferrite core to create blocking impedance as often as possible. There are clip-on ferrites that you just put on the outside of the cable. You can buy them in different sizes. If you use a clip-on, try to get a larger version than what you actually need and run that cable through twice or 3 times, because that will dramatically increase that blocking factor that you are dealing with. Cable TV interference. They are usually the result of broken shielding somewhere in the cable. Cable TV interference means you transmit and your TV goes haywire, even though you don't have an antenna on the roof anymore. This comes in through the coax cable. And this is either loose connections, broken connections, or corroded connections. And this is usually solved by proper cable maintenance by the cable supplier. So if Spectrum installed the cables in your house and something is wrong with those cables, you call Spectrum. Hopefully they will come and replace the cables so that everything is in proper working order again. The first thing you try to do whenever you are dealing with cable TV interference is you just tighten all those F connectors, those coax connectors in the back of the TV and the cable box and everywhere else where you have these cable TV coax cables. There's a pretty good chance that one connector just got loose, and by tightening it, you will cure that problem. Unfortunately, with a lot more equipment around our houses that run on electricity, we are actually adding noise sources to our environment. A noise source, an electrical noise source, an RF noise source, is anything that has electrical arcs. So every time you see a spark, you are creating RF noise. And this can be in a motor. It can be in thermostats. So the thermostat turns on and off. There might be a little spark in there that you might not even see, but you can hear it. Electric fences, they click every second or so. Neon signs are really bad. By the way, electrical arcs are also what gets produced when you have a lightning strike. So when there is lightning, when there's a thunderstorm anywhere in the area, and area here I mean several hundred miles, you will hear this on the HF frequencies. Every time there's a lightning strike somewhere, you hear it crackle in your radio. Power lines, and when it comes to power lines, transformers are, when they die or on their way out, they are bad sources of noise. Motor vehicle ignitions or alternators, really bad. Switching power supplies. Bad ones produce a lot of noise. Good ones, not so much. Unfortunately, we have a lot of bad ones around our houses. And then computers, networks, and TV sets. Plasma TVs, really bad. Fortunately, there are not too many of these around anymore. They mostly get replaced with LCD or OLED screens, which are much better. But if you have a plasma TV in your neighborhood, you will know, because the noise level goes up when people start to watch TV in the evening. And then when they turn the TV off at 10:30, the noise goes away again. So when it comes to RFI, make sure that you operate your equipment properly so that you are not the source of RFI. Eliminate all the interference in your own home. A good way to figure out whether something is coming from your own house or from the outside is to have your radio powered by battery, and then you turn all the breakers off so that nothing in your house is powered anymore. And then you make sure that all the stuff that could potentially run off battery, like your laptop, gets powered off as well. If the interference then is gone, you know it's coming from your house, and then you can try to figure out which of those many power supplies, switching power supplies that you have, is causing it. If it's still there, it means it's coming from the outside. Use good station building practices to eliminate unwanted signals. And this means use shielded wire and cables, shield your equipment, and use good connectors and filters. So spend some money there. Don't buy the cheapest stuff, because eventually you will regret it. When we are dealing with RFI that's not coming from our own house, oh, actually, this is the opposite. If somebody says, hey, you with a big antenna tower in your backyard, you are the cause of all the bad stuff that's happening with my TV in my house, because everybody just likes to blame the guy with the big antenna tower. So take these interference complaints seriously. When somebody complains, make sure that you really are not the cause. And the best way to do this is by demonstrating you don't have interference within your own home. So if somebody says, my TV, whenever it's tuned to this cable channel, goes crazy, you can tune your own TV to the same cable channel and transmit. And if it doesn't have any effect on your equipment, then it's very likely not you. However, offer to help eliminate the RFI, even if you are not at fault. So try to help your neighbor out in figuring out where this is coming from, and maybe tighten some coax connectors at their house in order to get rid of this RFI. Now, the ARRL has an RFI resource desk, so you can call them for help and assistance if you are an ARRL member. So this is one of the benefits that you get with an ARRL membership, which actually just got a lot more expensive this year. They raised their prices. So which part of the FCC rules and regulation affects ham radio? Remember that? Does 97 ring a bell? So that kind of implies that there are at least 96 other parts. Most of them are not really interesting for us. Part 15 is actually pretty interesting. Part 15 is what applies to unlicensed devices. So you go on Amazon and you buy that remote thermometer that you can put out in your backyard, and then you have a display in your house and you can see how warm or how cold it is out in the backyard. You don't need a license to operate that even though it uses radio frequencies, because this is licensed under Part 15. So there's, again, a big book of rules and regulations for these types of devices. And the FCC says any one of these Part 15 rules, licensed devices or unlicensed devices, may not interfere with any licensed radio service, and that includes amateur radio. Besides air traffic control, emergency responders, commercial licensed services, and so on. So there must not be any interference from such an unlicensed device to any licensed service. On the other hand, any one of these unlicensed devices must accept any interference that they receive from licensed services. So it does not matter whether your neighbor's remote thermometer goes crazy every time you transmit, because it's not my fault. That device needs to be able to withstand that interference. The FCC says so. And if they did a shoddy job when they designed the device or built the device, and it crashes every time it gets a little bit of interference, then this is not my problem. Any RFI from and to such unlicensed devices is the responsibility of the user or owner of such devices, not our responsibility. Now, you might have a hard time convincing your neighbor of that, but this is what the law says. So what it comes down to is, if your station is operating properly, then you are protected against interference complaints. But be a good neighbor, because, as I said, your neighbor will very likely not be familiar with the details of Part 15, and they may not care about that. They just say, oh, I paid $50 for that thing and it better works, regardless of whether you're transmitting or not. So you may have to do some education work there to help them. And this is the end of our RFI part. Again, I don't want to go through all the questions, but I want to pick out a few interesting ones that might help you in the long run. Which of the following conductors is preferred for bonding at RF? We actually had that in the first part. Any guesses?
Flat copper strap.
Yes, so you want a flat metal strap. And of course, copper would be the most expensive one. What is a symptom of RF feedback in a transmitter or transceiver? So RF feedback would be the radio frequency energy that you create is feeding back into your own radio.
C?
It's C, reports of garbled, distorted, or unintelligible voice transmissions. So that RF that gets fed back into your own radio is messing with that signal that it produces. And you end up with a very dirty signal. Which of the following could you use to cure distorted audio caused by RF current on the shield of a microphone cable?
Ferrite choke?
Yes. Yes. We want to block that RF current. We only want to let that audio frequency from the microphone go through that cable. So we use a ferrite choke. What would cause a broadcast AM or FM radio to receive an amateur radio transmission unintentionally? So I'm not transmitting on broadcast AM or FM frequencies, but somehow my signal still makes it into that radio. And this is because the receiver is unable to reject strong signals outside the AM or FM band. So it doesn't have strong enough filters in that radio to filter out other frequencies. How can fundamental overload of a non-amateur radio or TV receiver by an amateur signal be reduced or eliminated? So this is related, even though it's a little bit different.
E.
The right answer is actually A. We block the amateur signal with a filter at the antenna input of the affected receiver. So this would be at your neighbor's house. If they have a problem with you coming through the radio or the TV, then you, not necessarily you, your neighbor, hopefully, would put a filter on the antenna input of whatever receiver is affected by it. There's nothing we can do on our transmitter because we want to actually transmit, and our frequency that we put out has nothing to do with what they are receiving. So we cannot filter this on our end. It needs to be done on the affected receiver's end. Which of the following can reduce overload to a VHF transceiver from a nearby commercial FM station? Now I have the problem with I have an HF transceiver and I have an AM station in my neighborhood. So the same would apply here as well. So again, it's a filter that we want, and we want to install a band reject filter, and this would be a notch filter. So it would filter out this one band or a small range of frequencies. What should be the first step to resolve non-fiber optic cable TV interference caused by your amateur radio transmission? So what do you do before you spend any money?
Check the connectors.
Yes, you check the connectors. So in this case, it says, be sure all TV feedline coax connectors are installed properly. And at the same time, you might just check the cables. And if you see that you had some rodents chewing on your cables, there's a good chance that you might need a new piece of coax. Which of the following actions should you take if a neighbor tells you that your station's transmissions are interfering with their radio or TV reception? Anything we can rule out right off the bat?
Contact FCC. Rule that out.
We never contact the FCC unless we want to change our address or email address. So yeah, and because of that, this one is not correct either. And what the heck is a harmonic doubler? We've never heard of that. So that's not it either. So we want to make sure that our station is functioning properly and it does not cause interference to our own radio or TV when it is tuned to the same channel. What should you do if something in a neighbor's home is causing harmful interference to your amateur station?
Work with your neighbor.
Okay. Can we find at least 2 answers that are correct?
Oh, B, that FCC, as long as you're operating, I thought FCC.
And D, all these choices are correct.
Yes, yes, it's all of them. So we politely inform our neighbor that part 15 actually says, your cheap Chinese devices must take all the interference that we throw at them without complaining. And they cannot cause any harmful interference with anybody else. And then, of course, we want to make sure that our station is indeed up to the standards of good amateur practice. And this is the end of module 9B. So we had a rough start, but apparently the internet connection stayed up without any problems. And I really don't know what is causing this.
I think your neighbor's got some cheap Chinese equipment interfering.
Probably, yes, probably. And they're interfering with my Wi-Fi. Unfortunately, I'm doing this from a laptop which does not have a wired network connection, because that would have been an easy way to figure out if it is indeed the Wi-Fi that is causing the problems. So we did a quick run through the safety portion. And for the most part, safety should be common sense. If something feels wrong when it comes to taking shortcuts, don't do it, because there is usually a safety implication. And when it comes to RFI, unfortunately, this is something that we have to live with. As I said, we are adding more and more devices to our households, and every single one of them is adding to the noise floor that we are dealing with. And where I live, unfortunately, I have a pretty high noise floor. So when I turn my radio on, then I can only hear stronger signals. I cannot pull out the weakest signals. And this is one of the reasons why I like to go into parks and open areas, into these national parks, state forests, and so on, and operate from there, because you don't have any neighbors there. And the deer and the foxes and whatever is in the woods, even if it is bears, unless they have a tracking device, they are not interfering with you. And you get a really low noise floor, as long as you can stay away from power lines and other noise producing things.
That's why when you do your competitions in the park, you get away from all the interference.
Right. And that really changes how I can play radio. So that is one of the benefits. But I still can use my radio at home. So it does not mean that it's impossible, but
being right next to the major transmitters, you say you've got signal overload.
Yes, and I have filters for that. So they are filtering out most of this stuff. There's still there are still some associated problems. So even though they are trying to filter their harmonics out, the harmonics are so strong that close to the transmitter that I actually find that signal not just where it is on, I think it's 1280 or whatever the frequency of WHAM is. I find this on twice the frequency, 3 times the frequency, 5 times the frequency, and so on. So I find this all across the bands, in small portions of the bands. But unless I want to move to a quieter area, I just have to live with this.
Okay, I've got a spot here highlighted. Determine whether your renter's homeowner insurance will cover you for damage from lightning strike. And you say if you have a direct lightning strike, there's no protection against that?
There is no protection. There's nothing you can do. When you have a direct hit, then there is damage. What we can try to avoid is effects from nearby strikes. So whenever you have a lightning strike within, I don't know, a few hundred yards, there's a tremendous electric field that travels around that lightning strike. And that induces currents in anything that is metallic. And that would also apply to our antennas. And by having these lightning arresters, you are creating basically a short before that cable enters the house. And you're keeping that high voltage out of the house and away from your radio. And that might save your equipment. Now, if you have a lightning strike into the electrical wires outside of your house, on your street, or even in the neighborhood, that lightning again will travel through all the metal that's connected to that into your house and still fry everything, regardless of what you do with grounding your antenna and unplugging your antenna and all that kind of stuff. Because it will actually come through the outlets. So a direct hit, you can't do anything about that. A close by hit, we can mitigate some of the effects.
No, it says to put everything on one major on-off switch if lightning is coming. Now, if you do that with a big just taking everything off from line, that's your best protection, right?
You would think, unless again, lightning is traveling into your house from the power lines, and then that off-on switch will not prevent anything because it will actually arc across that switch.
Well, you need to, because my wife and I, for years, electrical storm, we just start unplugging computers, unplugging televisions, right? Just eliminate them from the wall socket.
Yes, and you want to have that cable actually a few feet away from the socket. Because again, lightning can jump.
So do you have a rider on your insurance? Or
no. No.
Okay. You know, I know it's not as prevalent in our area with lightning, like down in Florida and other areas, you know, lightning is 100% more frequent.
Oh, more than 100% more. Yeah, there are areas that are a lot worse than we are. So up here, it's not too bad. So any other questions about what we've talked about today, or anything we've talked about in the last 9 weeks? Because again, this is the end of the book. We've reached the end of the book. You've now seen all the topics. You should have practiced all the questions that might be on the test. The whole question pool, all 420 questions or whatever it is. And what it comes down to now, you have a little bit more than 2 weeks left. No, a little bit more than 1 week left before the RaRa testing on the whatever the date is. What it comes down to is try to practice as much as possible. Go through those questions again and again and again. Do practice tests and just try to get familiar with the right answers. Again, you do not need to know why something is the right answer. As long as you can say, this is the right answer. I've seen this question now 20 times, and 19 out of those 20 times I picked this and I was right. That's what it comes down to. And then with that practice, you should have, by doing the practice test, you should have a good idea of how you are doing, because the practice test will tell you how many questions you got right or how many you got wrong. And if you are better than 73%, if you get more right than 26 or more, then you are good to go. If you can do this on a regular basis, you do not have to get to 100%. Now, if you happen to do 100% every single time you take a test, a practice test, just go and take the test. Try to find a way to take the test as quickly as possible, because you want to give your brain a break and allow it to forget some of that stuff. I know, Frank, you took an online test. That's always an option. If you feel really good about how you're doing, then paying those $15 and taking that test is a small investment that will then give you quite a bit of peace of mind afterwards when you pass, and you don't have to wait 10 more days or whatever it is to take the test, or even longer if you have a conflict on that Saturday. So yeah, try to do this as quickly as possible. I think I did send out information about the Canandaigua testing, which is, I think, the week before the RaRa testing on a Wednesday evening. So if that is more convenient for you and you feel ready, that's another option. They also want you to pre-register. Information about how to do that is, again, on their website. And I took my last test in Canandaigua just because it was more convenient. There's no rivalry of the clubs about who gets to hand out licenses or upgrades. We are all happy when you get your license or when you upgrade, regardless of where you do it.
Is there a regular meeting tomorrow night? First Wednesday of the month?
There is a regular meeting tomorrow night, and it actually has an interesting topic because it's about getting started with VHF and UHF. And we've done that, I think, 4 years ago, and we thought it's time to do this again because we have so many new people in the club, and we think that somebody new to the hobby or somebody who does not have a lot of VHF, UHF repeater experience might benefit from that.
Well, I'm on board. I'll see you there tomorrow night.
Okay.
Where is the meeting?
We are at the Boy Scouts on Brighton Henrietta Town Line Road. It's in Henrietta. It's yeah, how do I describe that?
I'm familiar with Brighton Henrietta Town Line Road.
Mm-hmm.
Is it 7 o'clock?
It's 7 o'clock, yes.
Okay.
And it usually runs for about 2 hours. So we have, in the first hour, we have official business, we have announcements, and then in the second, then we have a break with some refreshments. There's coffee and donuts usually, if somebody brings them. And then there's a raffle. You can buy raffle tickets and win something. And then in the second half, we have the presentation.
Oh, okay.
And you can either join in person at the Boy Scouts, or you can join online. Our meetings are hybrid, so you don't even have to leave your house. You can just jump on the computer and watch it while it is happening over the internet. And we do ask if people on the online meeting have any input. They can raise their hand and say, hey, I want to add something here. I want to ask a question. So you're still participating almost as if you would be in the room.
Okay, cool.
Okay, and it's getting close to 8 o'clock. So unless you have something for me, I think we're done here for today. And again, I apologize for the problems we had before.
No problem.
I do not know what's going on here. I need to do some research and figure out what's interfering with my computer.
I would call Glenn Johnson.
Yes.
Thanks, Carl.
Thank you
Yep.
for joining. I hope to see you again next week. And again, for
Yes,
next
sir.
week, come prepared with questions and topics and things you want to talk about.
Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thanks,
Yes, sir.
Carl. See you guys later.
Bye.